Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our podcast channel, The History Bros. I'm Nathan. I'll be your host today, and let's get right into it. Today, we're going to be looking at the extent that the goals of the Civil War were achieved. Now, if you have been tuning into our previous videos, we've been talking about the events that have been leading up to the Civil War, such as the Dred Scott decision, the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of the Mexican Cession, Bleeding Kansas, and several other of these different events in this history. And now we're going to move on to the Civil War. Let's get right into it. You may believe that the war was fought primarily over the states' rights to slavery. What if I told you this wasn't even acknowledged until a full 2 years into the war? So the Civil War prevented the secession of 11 states, and it kept the nation intact again. But as every war does, it comes with a cost, and in this historical analysis, we're going to be analyzing the limit to how much the outcome of the war achieved and what underlying problems were not answered by this war. So let's get into it. First, we're going to have an overview of the Civil War. We'll look at both perspectives of the war and each side's interests, what the outcome was, and we'll include some key facts, an overview of the series of events that happened, and how Reconstruction was executed following the war. We'll also emphasize the various groups that were affected by this war and how they lived their lives after the war. And at the end, we're going to have a full evaluation, so stick around for that. We'll evaluate how effective Reconstruction was and how effective the goals were achieved. So we're going to go into the interests of the North first. The North was interested in reunifying the country and abolishing slavery. And so the North was dominated by Republicans, and not all of them were abolitionists, but some of them were. And abolitionists thought that slavery was immoral and they wanted to abolish it. But many others didn't support abolitionism or abolishing slavery. They only wanted to stop the expansion of slavery because they feared that slaves would take over their land, especially like westward expansion, and this would hinder their advancements in westward expansion. And this group was known as the Union during the war. They wanted to preserve the Union and stop the South from seceding. And key figures were President Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant. The prominent leaders of the South was General Robert E. Lee, who was a key figure because he was an experienced general who led many victories, and President was Jefferson Davis. And the interest of the South was to gain independence from the North. They wanted the free right to practice slavery and to own slaves. And all the events mentioned earlier about Bleeding Kansas and the Dred Scott decision, and these events led to the growing tension and distrust between the North and South. And in the years prior, as we talked about in recent podcasts, the years prior, there was already growing tension and sectional differences between the North and South over slavery and states' rights. And this eventually boiled over into the Civil War. So now we're going to look at the geography of both sides. The North, this is the dark blue. They have the North. They have a Western territory, including California and areas of Oregon and Nevada. The border states are in light blue. They're the most important to know. These are Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. So the border states were key to the Union's success because they provided minerals and agriculture. They had geographical advantages, such as access to the Mississippi River. They also had railroads, and they had access to the Ohio River from the border states too. This was also part of the reason why President Lincoln waited to address the Emancipation Proclamation, because he didn't want to say that this was a war against slavery and then upset the border states into further seceding. And the regional differences also led to the splitting of Virginia into West Virginia and Virginia. So West Virginia became part of the Union and a border state. Virginia became part of the Confederacy and seceded. So now let's go into the Civil War, the beginning of it. So it started April 12th, 1861. The beginning started with the presidential election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln was elected. And so with his election, this prompts South Carolina to secede because they've had enough. He's a Republican, and he supported not allowing slavery to expand, but into the westward expansion territory. But South Carolina didn't want to take any chances, and they had enough, so they seceded. And many other southern states, 10 of them, they followed South Carolina, and they created a government at Montgomery, Alabama, and they formed the Confederate States of America with their own constitution. One of the first significant battles was the Fort Sumter battle. This was the first, marked the beginning of the war, basically. So Lincoln tried to resupply this island with resources and not weapons, he assured the South, but they still demanded the evacuation of the North from this island because it was such a essential port to Charleston, South Carolina, which was one of the port cities of the Confederacy. And eventually they attacked the fort and forced the North to evacuate, and this ended up as a victory, even though there was no casualties suffered, but it marked the beginning of the war. Now we're going to go over to the strengths and weaknesses of each side. So the strengths of the North, they had a large army, they had a much greater population, they were industrialized and they had factories, and industrialization played a key part to their mass production of weaponry, and their technology was superior to the South because of this too. The South, they had greater leadership in the form of their war generals, because many of them, such as Lee, were experienced. They had the easier job of playing defense. They only had to protect their territory, essentially, and the North had to invade them and conquer back what was once part of the U.S. And this was not easy because the South had a large geography too. The South also had the advantage of having cotton, so cotton was something that the U.S. economy profited off of because of foreign affairs, so other countries would buy their cotton, and the South hoped that the foreign countries would support them because of their cotton. One of the cons was their weak economy, though. They had to establish a united government, and Jefferson Davis didn't really accomplish that during his time as president, and this can be seen as the morale of the South started to die down as the war grew longer and more strenuous. They had less number of troops, they didn't industrialize, they were based off of an agricultural economy, and then they also had less supplies. So here's a quick timeline of the war. The Confederacy did well early on in their battles, and they forced the Union to go through a rotation of many war generals because many of them didn't get the job done, so Lincoln had to fire them. The Union their main plan was to initiate a blockade called the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to starve the South of their supplies by surrounding them on all sides, and by have a naval blockade near the Atlantic Ocean surrounding them, and also by surrounding the Mississippi River and controlling that source of transportation, and then they could, in effect, starve the South of their supplies. And initially, the South did have many victories. So at Fort Sumter and at the two battles of Bull Run in the beginning, they were victorious, and it showed that victory wouldn't be easy for the North. and they would really have to engage in a long battle. The Union tried to capture their capital, Richmond, several times, but they were held back and stopped. And the war went on for a while until there was a turning point at the Battle of Antietam, and this was General Lee versus General McClellan of the Union. And even though it was a stalemate, it prompted President Lincoln to address the Emancipation Proclamation, which officially declared this a war against slavery, and that the U.S. would abolish slavery in the South, so slaves were essentially free officially. And so later the U.S. had significant wins at the Battle of Gettysburg. That's a very significant battle because it stopped the hopes of Confederate invasion for good. And then the siege of Vicksburg, they took over the Mississippi River and had full control. So this was also a very strategic battle and great victory. During the war, it is important to note that free blacks, they were paid less than white soldiers, and they faced lots of discrimination, and they also were in greater risk of being punished if they're captured by the Confederate Army. And we'll go over some of the ways blacks and freedmen were discriminated after the war in our next slides. So stick around for that. So at the end of the war, the morale of the South basically declines because of the high taxes and the prices for food rising that resulted from their lack of resources. And people were starving, and many had to support their families, so they left the army, especially in an army that had to eventually have a draft to force people to fight. That also lowered their morale. The South took a huge toll with the battles being lost at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and the support eventually dies down. Then this all culminated in the Appomattox surrender. So at the Appomattox courthouse, General Lee signs the document of surrender to General Grant, and it was clear that the South had no other choice, and they just wanted to prevent greater casualties to the war. And so the impact of the war, we're going to go into some of that soon. Right now, we're going to start with Reconstruction. So the death of President Lincoln, his assassination, gave Andrew Johnson the power of president, and he went on to influence Reconstruction by his ideals. He often clashed with Congress over his approach, and his Democratic background and leniency on pardoning Confederate generals made his relationship with Republicans in Congress very uneasy. And a key term that we should all know is radical Republicans. These were Republican leaders who favored the abolition of slavery prior to the Civil War. Later, they opposed Johnson's Reconstruction plan because they wanted a harsher treatment of the South that they didn't think he was doing a good job of. And yeah, let's go on. We're going to go into the key amendments passed. There are 3 key amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and they all increase the rights of African Americans, and in general just the rights of American citizens. And they're very important to our Constitution today still, and very significant. So 13th abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. 14th provided equal protection under the law. And the 15th basically guaranteed the right to vote not to be denied based on someone's race. We're going to take a quick break here, but we'll be back in 5 minutes, so stick around. And